And welcome to this, well, first, in fact, Reform online event. I'm just going to give it a few seconds because it can take a little while for the participants to sort of be pulled through so you can actually see and hear us. But while we wait for that to happen, I thought we'd do a little bit of an experiment to see just how useful our panellists have been today, so no pressure to the three of them. But I thought we'd do the same poll at the start of the event as at the end of the event to get your views on how we should approach getting back to sound public finances. So I'm just going to put up a poll. If everyone who is already online now with us could respond, don't worry, it is anonymous. So I'm not going to be able to call you out and say, well, so-and-so thinks this. The panelists can also vote if you'd like to. And again, I won't be able to see how you voted. So our question is, how should the government approach the public finances over the next 12 to 24 months? So obviously, part of this is how you think the finances are going to shape out and what the recovery might look like over that period. But your options, and I can see people are voting away, which is fantastic, are cut spending, which isn't proving to be a very popular option at the moment, raise taxes, keep borrowing for that period, so up to another 2 years, a combination of the above, which obviously could be, you know, all three or two or whatever, or you don't know, but hopefully this event will tell you and give you the answers, and that's where a little bit of pressure on our panellists. Thank you. So I'll just give it a few more seconds. We're almost at capacity, which is fantastic. This has been a very, very popular event. So I'll give it just 3 more seconds, and then it's been up for a minute. It doesn't seem to be changing now, although I think quite a few people haven't voted, but there we go. Okay, I'm going to share the results, perhaps slightly predictably. Here we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. Yes, slightly predictably. It is a combination of all of the above. Perhaps I should have given a combination of taxes and borrowing, or spending and borrowing, but there we go. So we will see. So in fact, I should make a little note of that. So 65% said a combination. We will see if that changes when we launch the same poll at the end, or whether it's going to stay the same. So let me just stop that. Hopefully that has given everybody time to join. Yeah, we are almost at capacity, so that is very good. So again, welcome. This is, as I said, the first of the Reform webinars. For many of you who've been to Reform events before, we do an awful lot of them, but it's slightly terrifying actually to be chairing the first one online, and I'm hoping that we don't get any glitches or any technical issues. I've done several run-throughs, but please do bear with us if that does happen. I also just wanted to say that I'm going to be looking at a screen I have to the right of me, because that is where the questions, your questions, and I'll explain that in a second, are going to be coming through. So it's not that I've got bored and decided to read my emails, it is that I am looking at the questions that you're posting. So just wanted to make that clear up front. So today's topic is charting the course back to black. The hashtag is back to black. If you'd like to be tweeting about it, please do. I'm sure there will be fascinating comments and insights that you can share. We're all very aware of the current situation, so I'm not going to labour the point that, you know, we currently have, not just in the UK, in fact in many countries across the world, economies have been put in a sort of deep freeze. The fiscal stimulus packages that have been put in place are eye-wateringly large, arguably necessarily eye-wateringly large, but clearly there are many questions about the impact that those measures are going to have on the public finances, how sustainable they are, and obviously how we unwind a lot of those measures. The deficit, and I'm going to come to Paul in a minute to ask him just to do a quick explainer. I'm sure everybody is terribly au fait with the difference between debt and deficit. We're going to have a little explainer anyway, but projections of where the deficit may be at the end of the year are between 300 and 500 billion pounds. So these are very, very large numbers. We had some stats out today proving just how large some of those numbers may be looking. I'm sure we'll touch on those. And of course, debt is likely to be well above 100% of GDP, which may or may not be a worry, depending on where you stand on that. Clearly, a lot will depend on what the shape of the recovery looks like as we go forward. And some of the projections we've seen have perhaps been somewhat optimistically based on it being a V-shaped rebound. I'm sure, again, panellists will have a view of that. But ultimately, when you are spending this sort of scale of money, as our poll indicated, you largely have three options. Spending that amount of money, you largely have three options. So you can either keep borrowing, and some people, as we saw, will think that's absolutely the right thing to do. There's obviously questions about timeframes. You cut spending, which the PM seems broadly to have ruled out, but perhaps there might be some wriggle room depending on where. Or you raise taxes. Now, clearly, that's a massive oversimplification, because there's all sorts of questions that then sit under that of what taxes, what spending, can you do a combination, etc. But broadly, that's where we are, and that's how we're going to have to think in terms of getting back to a point where we have sound finances. But also within that, there are going to be trade-offs. So how far do you prioritise getting back to sound finances, if that might have some form of negative impact on getting back to an economic rebound, so getting the economy back on track. And again, I'm sure some Conservative backbenchers in particular would have a view of whether raising taxes might be counterproductive. But again, it depends on what taxes. So before I probably introduce our panellists, Paul, can I just ask you to do just a wee explainer on what the difference between debt and deficit is, just in case anybody gets that a little bit confused in the conversation?
Well, that's an easy one. Keep them that easy. The deficit is just the difference between government's revenues and spending in any one year. So if it's bringing in £1 trillion and spending 1.1 trillion, it's got a deficit of 100 billion. The debt is the accumulated impact of all previous deficits. So you could easily have a surplus this year, but still have a very big debt. But if you've got a deficit this year, which is, then you're going to be adding to your debt. It's worth thinking about both to some extent in terms of tens, hundreds or thousands of billions. But certainly when you're making comparisons, it's probably best to think of them, as you mentioned, in terms of fractions of national income. So essentially, if you've got a deficit of more than 3% of national income, say, then your debt is probably going to be rising as a fraction of national income, and that's quite an important way.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have a terribly qualified panel, which is always a great thing to be able to say, although again, no pressure. But just to recap, so Paul, obviously we heard from there, Paul Johnson, Director of the IFS, and I'm sure everybody has seen him on and off the television in the last few years. There's been a lot of commentary around public spending and economic matters. We then have Lord Nicholas Macpherson, who, again, you will all be very aware, was Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, so head of the Treasury between, I think, 2005 and 2016. Took us through the crash and then the response to the crash. So hopefully you should have some good insights in terms of how you respond to this sort of shock, although lots of differences. And then Polly Mackenzie, who is director of the think tank Demos, and who also has some experience of being in the heart of government in dealing with crises or shocks, because was director of policy for Nick Clegg, the deputy prime minister during the coalition years. So some real experience of both dealing with this and massive insight into kind of options and potential unintended consequences, I guess, of taking different paths on our route back to black. So just a very quick, before I ask each of our panellists to do some opening comments, just in terms of attendees, it's fantastic to have so many of you. Please do post your questions. If you haven't done a Zoom webinar yet, you can see just at the bottom of your screen, if you hover over it, over the Zoom window, it's got a little button that says Q&A. Please post your questions in the Q&A. If you put questions in the chat, we won't be looking at that. So please make sure any Q&A goes into that Q&A function, and we will do our very best. As you can imagine, it's somewhat more difficult trying to chair something, read the questions, pose them, etc., than if you just have someone standing up and asking them. So we'll do our best to answer them, and we will group some of them together so that hopefully we can cover the majority of things people want to know about. So Before we go into Q&A, we are going to get some opening comments to set the scene from our panellists. So Paul, can I start with you, please, for about 5 minutes?
Yes, thanks very much, Charlie. I'll try and be relatively brief, but going first, I think to set the scene a little bit. Most of you will have seen today's extraordinary borrowing numbers, way the highest borrowing in a single month ever. And indeed, April's borrowing far higher than we expected before the COVID crisis for the entire year. And so that's certainly taking us towards borrowing of above 300 billion and hence more than 15% of national income this year. Again, you know, we talked about peacetime records back in 2009, 2010. Well, we're smashing those out of the park. Not surprising, I guess, given the scale of what's being done. I mean, I think one thing that's particularly interesting about the scale of the deficit is that if you look back at 2009, 10 and other previous recessions, the largest, by far the biggest part of that was down to the contraction of the economy and reduction in tax receipts. Well, that's happening this time, but a much bigger fraction than normal is being taken up by government policy responses. So we've got at least 120 billion of government policy responses now. You know, it's very easy to get lost in the size of these numbers. That's an enormous number. As the Chancellor has pointed out, we're spending as much each month on the furlough scheme as we spend on the NHS, which is itself by far the biggest thing that government does. So, so two things I think stand out in this crisis. One is just the sheer scale of the impact on the public finances, but the other is the very large extent to which that's down to government decisions on spending and to some extent tax. And of course, it all reflects government decisions about locking the economy down and so on. So one of the big issues about coming out of this, I mean, before one talks of the longer run decisions on tax and spending, is actually, and really crucially, how we move away from what are supposed to be short run changes. And we've seen the difficulty around that as we move away from, or try to move away from, the furlough scheme. The Chancellor has certainly erred on the side of generosity in saying that employees will continue to get 80% of their pay all the way through to the end of October, though he remains to be seen what role employers will play in paying that. I think one of the things that we'll see as we come out of this is that whilst it's very easy to turn the spending taps on and to give people tax holidays, it's going to be rather harder to turn the spending taps off. And that won't, you know, that won't be austerity. That will just be a return to the status quo. There are lots of other examples of that. One which I suspect we won't ever, or in the short run, move away from, is the increased generosity of the welfare system. I think we spent spending an extra 8 billion relative to the status quo on universal credit and housing benefit, now local housing allowance. My view is it's going to be quite hard politically to move away from that, and certainly for the housing benefit system to return that to the status quo ante would look very odd indeed. So I think one of the things that will just naturally come out of this crisis will be a more generous welfare system and probably more spending on the NHS. Again, we will see, I think, it re-baselined on in terms of what's spent this year. So I think it's a first really key question is how we move away from where we are safely, and the second is how we then translate that into the baseline going forward. And the big issues going forward are absolutely fundamentally driven by what happens to the economy over the next 2 or 3 years. If the economy does what the OBR and Bank of England sort of baseline scenarios, they don't call them forecasts, but they do call them baseline scenarios, suggest, which is essentially bounce back to where it otherwise would have been within a couple of years. And as you said at the beginning, Charlie, I think most people think that's pretty optimistic. But if the economy bounces back like that, well, then we'll all breathe an enormous sigh of relief. And in terms of the impact of the crisis on the public finances, we will essentially, carry on. We could broadly carry on very much as before. We would just go forward with a debt of 100% of national income rather than 80% of national income, or whatever those numbers are. A much more likely scenario, I think, is that the economy will, for a considerable period of time, be smaller than it otherwise would have been. That will mean maintaining previous tax and spending plans will result in the debt on an ever-increasing path, and the debt can't stay on an ever-increasing path forever. So then you have these enormously difficult choices around when you start to pull it off that path and how you make that a credible set of choices. I broadly agree with the polling at the beginning of this. We're going to have to be borrowing for the next 12 to 24 months, and that's going to be the largest part of the response over that period. But that can't be the permanent response. My view essentially is that after a decade of spending cuts, it's pretty hard to see that a large part of the response to this going forward will be continued spending cuts. But I think it was George Osborne pointed out, if we are permanently poorer, which we may well be, then we're going to have to cut our cloth one way or another. And if that's not through reduced public services, it will have to be through higher taxes. And it's a kind of really boring thing that I've said a million times over the last decade, that in the end, you really do only have a choice between taxes, deficits and spending. And if deficits can't go on forever in a way that they're increasing national income, debt as a fraction of national income, and they can't go on forever, then you've got to make a choice between the spending and the tax. Over the last decade, we've largely made that choice on the spending side. I think on the following decade, we're probably largely going to have to make that choice on the tax side.
Great, thank you very much. And it is, I think, interesting, and perhaps we can come back to this, and I think some of the questions already coming through around how far we do just carry the debt and how long for, and clearly there are all sorts of questions as to what happens to interest rates, what happens to the size of the economy, how far it is scarred, etc. But also an interesting point that perhaps the new normal is higher spending anyway, so in a sense there's even more work to do in terms of getting back to sound public finances. So I'm going to move to Nick next, please, who I'm sure everybody will be very aware has the most wonderful hashtag on many of your tweets, which is sound money. So I'm sure you will have some great insights in terms of what that means and kind of how we might get to it. So Nick, over to you.
Well, I'm pretty much in the Paul Johnson camp. Clearly, we're going to borrow a lot more over the next 18 months. We're already going to, I think even this month, we're well on track to borrow more than during the financial crisis. I think the only question is, do we end up spending about as much on coronavirus as we spent on a world war? I think at present we'll probably fall short of the cost of a world war, but we could come close if we manage the economy badly. Obviously, in the short run, Bank of England's hoovering up all this debt, that's fine. But if the government becomes dependent on the Bank of England effectively to print ever increasing amounts of money, I don't think this will end well. And I think there are going to be interesting issues in the years ahead about whether the Bank of England is still operationally independent. I'm just beginning to worry a little bit on that front. History suggests that generally when you have a major debt blowout, like after the Napoleonic Wars or after the Second World War, generally the best way to get out of it is growth. People think Gladstone, ran a very tight fiscal policy. He did, but actually it was steady growth through the 19th century, which basically reduced the national debt back to the manageable level it was in about 1910. So growth is really important. Every government says it's got a growth strategy. They always look pretty much the same, but they're always repackaged every 2 years with radical reforms, lots of deck chairs being moved. And if only the government would actually focus on skills, infrastructure with a high economic return and stick to it, there might be some hope, but we shouldn't rely on growth. The fact is, over the last 10 years since the financial crisis, productivity growth has been virtually non-existent. I see nothing in this crisis so far which suggests we will come through stronger on productivity. If anything, faced with the prospect of a hard Brexit around the end of the year, we could come through weaker. So we've got to face facts. As Paul says, I think all the pressures coming out of this crisis are going to be on increased spending. Public opinion will require greater capacity in the NHS. People will want to start having care homes fit for an elderly population, not a bunch of bankrupt providers paying minimum wage to foreign people who are expected to pay their immigration charges, because I'm not sure they were covered by the announcement yesterday. I'm all for cutting public spending. It's quite high, but nevertheless, I don't think, I've seen nothing in what this government has said which suggests it's prepared to begin a debate on that. For my part, I would be happy tomorrow, indeed I've been advocating it for about the last 10 years, totally unsuccessfully, to review the so-called triple lock for the basic state pension. But I don't think I'm going to succeed in the short run on that. So you've got to look at tax. And here you get lots of sort of armchair Treasury officials who say you should do something about multinationals, you should do something about the rich. Yeah, of course we should, but actually getting any revenue from those sources is virtually impossible. Indeed, getting revenue in is really difficult. And the government, even before the crisis, is projecting as much revenue from taxes next year and national insurance as from under any Tory government since the war. So taxes actually are high by historical standards, but they're going to have to go higher. And the reality is the only way you can get more tax revenue in serious terms is through VAT, national insurance, and income tax. And there are no easy options on this. It requires leadership, and then it requires effective decision making. But it's going to happen. This country is it's already made a choice. We want to be like a Christian democratic or social democratic country in Europe, have high levels of public spending. The pity is that so far we've shown very little inclination to pay for it.
Thank you very much. I mean, lots of things there, which I hope we will come back to, not least the triple lock, as reform, similarly to, in fact, nearly all wonky think tanks have pointed out, it is an unaffordable and unnecessary level of uprating. But perhaps we'll get some questions. Perhaps we'll get some questions from people who benefit from the triple lock, putting the case otherwise. Polly, let me just unmute you, or you are unmuted. Perfect. So I'm sure you'll have lots of views on the direction of travel, and whether there's possibility that there's not possibility that it will be tax rises, etc. But also that there's going to be some complicated politics in this, and not least the point that Nick was making around those three main taxes, which do raise the majority of the revenue that we spend on public services, etc. That I think the Conservatives had a manifesto that said we wouldn't that they wouldn't raise any of those. So, rather complicating factor. It's a perfect moment to hand over to you, Polly, in the middle of homeschooling.
Sorry. There you go.
This is the joy of webinars, right?
So sorry. My husband and I have managed to have simultaneously important things. Okay, update now. Okay, we'll go plug it back.
The advantage of teenage children is that mine are still in bed.
Anyway, they were very happy in front of the TV. Okay, it's going to have to wait. Could you play something else? This is why there's a productivity problem. I know that's not true in any kind of scientific way, but right now it feels true. And so that's the end. Right, so on the substance, I don't really disagree with Nick or Paul, and it would be a fool's errand to attempt, really. So I think it'd be helpful to just give you some reflections on what the politics of this are like, because I think that shapes the landscape. And I think the politics of tax and spend, the landscape is so wide in terms of the divergence of opinions and the number of different positions that are now kind of quite close to the mainstream that are still so kind of different from each other. And if you think back to April 2009, we now think that austerity is such a horrible word. Everyone hates austerity, that it must have been an attack line dreamt up by the opposition. Actually, no. April 2009, David Cameron gave a speech literally entitled "The Age of Austerity." Ironically, kind of a Presbyterian, Gordon Brownlee type of virtue, and yet his attack was that we needed to live a different way as a nation, that austerity was a virtue. And over those 11 years, it's completely descended into toxicity, really, that idea. But it's also worth observing that certainly during the coalition years, the attacks on austerity were about attacks on spending cuts. They weren't really about whether we still had a deficit. The deficit was attacked as, look, you're trying to cut to get rid of the deficit and you still haven't got rid of it. But it wasn't the idea that fiscal contraction was a problem. It was the idea that spending cuts were a contraction. And I know that because from focus groups and from polls, all of the work that the Liberal Democrats did, obviously unsuccessfully, but was to try and counteract that argument by saying, look, when we were there, we helped make sure it was balanced, 20% tax rises, 80% spending cuts. Rather than entirely spending cuts, which is broadly what the Conservatives then went towards in 2015. So the idea was saying tax rises were sort of not austerity. And it's interesting to see that the way the conversation has evolved on the left, partly because of Jeremy Corbyn, is to make, on the one hand, I saw Stephen Bush, a New Statesman columnist, making the sort of correct fiscal economic point that tax rises are a form of austerity if you think that austerity is fiscal contraction rather than just spending cuts, reminding us of that. But also you have then the modern monetary theorist crowd, elevated by the Corbynista movement, who are both vocal and also, I mean, it depends on who you mean by that, quite influential still within a lot of the Labour movement. My first experience of them, weirdly, was I was on a panel a bit like this, but in a tent, real life, with Steve Baker about tax. And he stood up and said, the Conservative MP, for those who don't know him, and he stood up and said, I'm not one of those Conservatives who thinks that all tax is theft. I'm like, well, good, thank you. But so he was pitching himself as a moderate, but I don't think that's a moderate position, but nevertheless. So when it was my turn to speak, I just said, look, let's just remember that one of the reasons that we have tax is in order to pay for some public services that actually then, or infrastructure that actually helps businesses to grow. So it's not simply a case of you make your money and that the government steals some of it. It's that some of the things the government spends money on help you to make money. So it's not, let's not get into theft. Anyway, saying that tax is used to fund public services led to this kind of wall of hatred being kind of deluged at me, like vicious emails and horror, because a part of modern monetary theory, again, as I understand it, is this idea that you ought to use fiscal policy as the main lever of macroeconomic policy. But in its less kind of theoretical economist incarnation, it's turned into there literally is a magic money tree. There is no link between tax and spending. Tax is deleting money and spending is making money up. And the idea that there's any association between the two of them is a sort of fallacious construct of financial markets and bond traders and other ghastly evil people who basically ought to be eradicated. And obviously Corbyn no longer leads the Labour Party. That has shifted a bit, but we don't know about the shape and the direction of travel that Keir Starmer will take. And if Nick's right that in the end most chancellors end up with quite similar fiscal rules that they describe as entirely different from their opponents' fiscal rules. And we don't know what Rishi Sunak's position will evolve, and we don't know how how the Labour Party's position will evolve. But nevertheless, the parameters of what's possible and the idea of just deficit spending as a sort of virtue in and of itself, both on right and left, actually has become much more mainstream than certainly it was in 2010. Partly, I guess, because of the pain and the damage that austerity caused. And just one further kind of reflection is so two actually, just about words and feelings that you could, because often I think in the words they choose you can kind of sense where the politician's real instincts are. So Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he became a minister, wrote this like comical note about words that people, how to write like Jacob Rees-Mogg. And one of the things he put in is that you must never call spending investment. And it's clearly like somebody who's very triggered by Gordon Brown, who always called all spending investment, whether it had any relationship to investment at all or not. So if for Jacob Rees-Mogg, it's like going the other way. It's like, it's all spending. It's all just like money out the door, has no value. Obviously, both positions are wrong. Sometimes we spend money because it makes us happy or feels good or is social. It doesn't necessarily have a return. But there is still that big chunk of the conservative right who just can't get behind the idea that there's any value in public spending, really. And then the final one is simply how Boris Johnson responded to the word austerity when it was put to him by Keir Starmer. Is for him, there is no sense that austerity is a virtue. And so just to come around then to the question is back to black, I think the real question is there really any political momentum or enthusiasm for something that looks even close to black? What's halfway between black and red? Stripey? I don't know. It seems to me that it's perfectly possible that Nick will still be #soundmoney for the next 20 years. And it will take an entirely different political settlement before we get there.
Thank you. Again, fascinating questions. And in fact, one of the questions we've had come through is, does sound money look different in a new normal? So if we've historically largely bought into the golden rule, that new fiscal rule that New Labour introduced, which was, or kind of make a big deal of, which was that, in terms of current spending, current budget, you must raise what you spend, and then, to Polly's point, your investment money can be borrowed in terms of capital expenditure and things like that. Are we moving away from that and saying, actually, we are going to be happy just to have a bigger deficit for a vastly longer of time? And I guess the question, and perhaps Nick, I can put this to you as we are talking about sound money here. What are the risks, and what will be the warning signs, I suppose, that would mean that we would have to rapidly get the house more in order, because it would become, I don't know, risky in the markets, or would trigger kind of further economic unrest?
In the short run, the government's perfectly okay. I mean, look, it's hard to say there's an urgent need to clamp down on borrowing when the government managed to borrow at negative interest rates this week. That means people effectively are paying the government to lend to them. So in the short run, everything will be fine, and that's good. That's good for the nation. But there are also dangers in that. The problem with borrowing ever amounts of money is that at some point the markets turn against you, and usually by the time they do that, it's too late. Equally, you shouldn't be spending your whole time crying wolf and saying something must be done immediately. But if generally with British economic policy since the war, you have these periodic crises. I mean, they're never a total disaster. Britain always steps back from the brink. We haven't defaulted in the last 300, 400 years, and that's all to the good. We've got a fantastic debt management office. We've got a very deep capital market in London. It's a pity it's not very good at ensuring that capital reaches businesses in the rest of the UK, but it's very good at dealing in gilts. And we also have a very mature gilt market. I mean, the average tenor of our debt is something like 14 years, whereas every other G7 country is more like 6 to 7 years. So I'm not claiming that we've got some utterly urgent problem. What I do know is that countries which borrow more than 10% of national income over, you can get away with that for a year or two. But if you start doing it sort of for year 3, 4, 5, 6, you suddenly find you've got several 100%. Debt is several 100% of your national income. And then you do have a bit of a problem if people start worrying about whether they should lend to you. Usually in this country, it takes a form of, more recently, back in the 70s, it took the form of a sort of effectively a guilt buyer's strike. And, the government found it difficult to get to borrow. Latterly, it's tended to take the form of devaluation. But devaluation, once it really gets going, can be dangerous because it really adds to inflation. A lot of our debt is index linked. And the one thing we do know from successive devaluations, it doesn't actually do British industry much good. It just makes everybody worse off. So I think the government needs to have a credible plan in the medium term. And that is not about running surpluses or that sort of thing, but it is about having a clear strategy to begin to reduce debt as a percentage of national income.
Thank you. There's lots of questions coming in, which is fantastic, which shows that clearly we have got a very stimulating panel. I'm going to ask a couple which are related more directly to this question around kind of deficit debt, etc., and then move more into the mechanisms and the tough choices that are going to lie ahead, as Nick was saying, at least in the medium term, if not in the short term. So Paul, perhaps I could come to you. So lots of people asking about the debt and whether, what really would be the problem of defaulting. Is it a problem? Could we just, have a one-off kind of write-off of the debt that the central bank holds? Could we treat it like debt after the World War? I guess, what's your perspective on anything that might be a bit more radical than just accepting for a period of time and then slowly trying to reduce the debt?
Well, none of that really reflects what happened after the World War. I think, as Nick said, what really happened after the last war is that we spent, until the early 70s, we spent 30 years growing, and we didn't need to run big surpluses over that period. In fact, we didn't run surpluses at all over that period to get debt as a fraction of national income down a long way. We got debt as a fraction of national income down by running small deficits and growing in nominal terms quite a lot for quite a long time. And there's no question whatever that will be the best outcome from this current crisis as well. But as Nick says, just relying on growth is a dangerous thing to do, because it doesn't always come along, and politicians are much less good at achieving it than they think they are. In general, defaulting on debt would clearly be somewhere between disastrous and catastrophic for all sorts of reasons. In the kind of very simple terms, there's lots of pension funds and so on which are heavily invested in government debt, and if government defaulted, then they would go bust, and so would the whole pensioner population. I think there's a more interesting question around the Bank of England and its holding of debt. They're clearly absolutely, they are absolutely clear that this is a commercial holding that will may be rolled over, may be sold on at the appropriate time when it is required for them to meet their inflation target. And in that sense, we should see this as the same as any other debt that's held. I think there's a and that's certainly how they see it. Nick raised the issue that he was somewhat concerned that the bank could become seen as, or be, an arm of government, in that it is clearly it is clearly much easier for government to sell vast amounts of debt at the moment when the market knows that the certainly up till now, the bank has essentially engaged in a quantitative easing exercise, which is equivalent to the amount of additional debt that government is selling. Now, the bank would say, well, look, in a sense, that's coincidental. We have a remit. Our remit is to keep inflation on target and to support the economy. And we're absolutely clear that the best way of doing that at the moment is through QE. The issue, I think, for us is that it seems to me unlikely that in my lifetime they will be seriously unwinding. They'll be seriously unwinding that. And at the moment, I think their position is credible, because I think they are meeting they're meeting their remit. But the moment they are seen not to meet their remit, the moment they don't raise interest rates when it's clear that long-run inflation is high or that we're growing fast, and the moment that they don't start unwinding the QE when it becomes economically appropriate, because they're seen to be leaned on by government, is the moment we really do get into monetization of debt, and then in particular the inflationary consequences that would come from that.
Thank you. And Polly, in terms of this question about growth, so one of the things that's probably worth reflecting on is the fact that even pre-COVID, the economy was not exactly motoring at pace. In fact, we were seeing a global economic stuttering. I mean, I'm sure it's far from an economically technical term there. I'm sure Hans would correct me, but it was hardly on a trajectory which is the sort of thing we might need to see if growth is going to be, one of the answers. Now, clearly, the Conservatives came into power on an agenda which was about seeing much more investment, levelling up, and some of those kind of big things which in theory could have stimulated growth, though with the global context perhaps tricky. What do you think that government could do around the investment side and the trying to stimulate growth, thinking about kind of new jobs of the future, perhaps thinking about what the shape of the economy might need to look like if we're going to be dynamic, rather than perhaps holding on to some of the sectors which COVID is going to have hastened the demise of?
I was really struck by what we just heard, that politicians are much less good at generating growth than they think they are. You often read, think tank papers or op-eds that talk about how we're just going to get back to 3%, 4% growth. You think, well, sure. I mean, it is certainly true that if we had 4% growth for a sustained period of time, lots of these problems would diminish. But given that lots of people have tried and made concerted efforts and done things that plenty of economic theories would suggest would work, and we still have this kind of huge productivity problem. I would like to see a bit more humility from them about what's possible. I think lots of people have started to talk about tax cuts as a stimulus. It strikes me as a baffling argument, because corporation tax cuts don't help companies that are making catastrophic losses, and income tax cuts don't help people that don't have jobs. And so it seems to me that the balance of choice when it comes to kind of fiscal stimulus has to be on the spending side. And we remain in the foothills of, potentially catastrophic climate change. So it strikes me that though it then becomes politically difficult for some people, that the answer has to be around bringing together these twin challenges around redesigning our economy to be substantially less reliant on carbon, and finding some growth from kind of the ashes of what we've created. The Treasury has done a fantastic job at mobilizing policy at incredible speed to protect as many jobs as possible, but the reality is that redundancies are going to grow. Businesses will go to the wall, and the tax revenues are going to be severely impacted. This is a kind of unique economic challenge because the government has been actively suppressing economic activity to get people to stay at home. And so certainly at the moment, there's very little the government to do to stimulate demand, because loads of the things that you would want to do are just completely unviable when people can't get together. Obviously, we hope that will change relatively quickly. We don't know how quickly. But whenever it comes, the focus, I think, has to be around investment, and investment that helps us to decarbonise. Some of that's going to have to be in the northern half of the country, just as this government has promised. It's challenging though, because it's not because of malice that for the last 30 years, when most investment decisions, they have gone to the southeast. It's not because people in the Treasury are just nasty and think less of people in the north. It is very, very often because the simple return on investment is much easier to demonstrate and justify when you're investing in places that are growing already. And, this is the case in a whole range of different public policy challenges. Public health is, and physical activity is a really interesting thing. If you invest money in getting people to eat more healthily and take more activity, the people it helps quickest and most are the people who are already pretty healthy. And so actually when you invest, you risk stretching out inequality by helping the high performers to do better. We found that with the new homes bonus, trying to incentivize councils to build houses, actually just washed money towards places that were already growing and took it away from places that were struggling. So that does require a change in our approach that thinks perhaps more about the long term and thinks about the resources of the north, potentially in terms of driving the kind of the decarbonisation industrial revolution, just as the north was so powerful during the 19th century's industrial revolution. But it requires also, I think, more humility again from the politicians to not sell this line that they're the first people to try, and to recognise that they're actually making a choice of things that take longer and pay less. And so therefore we're going to have to be even more patient about a return to kind of the sound money dream.
Great, thank you. So I do want us to move into a conversation about taxes, which all of a sudden is a sort of quite exciting, sexy topic to talk about, which is
always sexy, Charlotte.
No, I was going to say us wonks think it's always a sexy topic, but now the whole country does. So, so now we're in the right space. So I guess, can I perhaps come to Nick, you first, because you have written recently about this problem, and you touched on it indeed in your opening comments about how everybody says, well, why don't we just go after the rich and, let's stop all this tax avoidance or even evasion, let's get the multinationals who aren't paying their fair share, etc. Which, all sounds very nice and fair and what have you, but if you look globally at various countries that have tried to do more on this, it's not always terribly easy to raise the revenues. But you did suggest that perhaps there might be a new form of tax. How popular that might be, I don't know, given the current, there is a sort of question around the new normal. People may well be willing to pay it, which would be a more of a, what you called it was a solidarity type tax. I think that might have been the name. I wonder if you could talk a bit about what you're thinking there.
Well, my starting point is that we're going to have to raise quite a lot of money. So I've seen some really good suggestions from the questioners, like taxing cannabis, which sounds a good plan. Probably need to legalise it at the same time. Not against that. We could have a wealth tax, but you only have to look at successive socialist French governments to find that they always disappoint. But by all means, look at them. What makes a good tax are ones which are easy to collect. I bet you none of the, well, probably the listeners who are very sensible people know precisely what they paid in PAYE last month, but most of us haven't a clue. Yet we pay infinitely more in PAYE than we do in council tax, where we have to write a cheque or at least have a direct debit on our bank account, so we notice it. So a tax has to be easy to collect. The reason I focus, I propose something like a social solidarity tax or a used form of social insurance, is I think national insurance has been is a good tax. It's relatively easy to raise, but it needs to be improved upon. The problem with national insurance is, apart from the fact that the better off pay a lower rate than people on lower incomes, a lower marginal rate, I should say, is that it's only paid by people who are working and who are below pension age. And we now have actually a lot of quite prosperous pensioners. Indeed, eventually I will be one in not too distant future myself. And we have a lot of taxable capacity. So I would like to see a tax slightly modelled on national insurance, but extended to all people on the basis of ability to pay. And it shouldn't just be chargeable on earnings. It should be chargeable on rents and dividends and pensions. And Paul will no doubt say, what you're really saying is you're proposing an income tax. Well, I am, but the great thing about national insurance is it doesn't have lots of reliefs. You know, if I give £1 billion to charity, I don't get a relief against national insurance. So, and I also think, given we've got to spend more on social care and health, being able to say, look, here is this new social charge, which is related in broad terms. And I know Paul will again claim this is a con. I'm not asking for some hypothecated fund, but I'm mindful of Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown is the only man only chancellor, who generally have been men, sorry, since in my working life, who implemented a discretionary tax increase. And that was to fund the NHS in 2002. He raised national insurance on employees and employers by 1%. He didn't have to do that. He wasn't forced into do it. He did it because he felt that he had created a consensus to spend more on the NHS. I think in the coming period, we need to follow that approach. I think people like taxes. Well, no one likes paying tax, and you may claim I'm arguing for a presentational con, and to some extent I am. But if you can relate a new tax to an area of spending which most people want, you will probably be more successful in creating a consensus in favour of it than sort of the ultimate stealth taxes.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's true no one wants to pay the taxes, but I also think it's true that we are going through a period of time where, at least when you look at polling around willingness to spend a bit more to get more from public services, actually that has shifted. So perhaps this is the moment to do it, although much like Polly's plea for politicians to show a bit more humility, I wonder if it's not hypothecated and therefore tied to a certain area of expenditure where the politicians would have the discipline to spend it on the thing they're saying that they would do. But that's probably a whole other conversation about politicians and their natures rather than...
I mean, they're going to have to spend it. We've got a demographic problem this decade. I can promise you, in 10 years' time, we're going to be spending a hell of a lot more on health and social care.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. Okay, so potentially a sort of new type of tax, but interestingly they're drawing in some of the issues that have been bubbling along, I mean, pre-COVID, but actually come more to the fore, which is around intergenerational fairness. And so, you know, whether we should actually be looking at taxing what are generally wealthier pensioners now than working age cohorts, but also bringing in, you know, effectively capital gains or revenue from what are seen as non-earnings, but in fact are of course income. So a couple of interesting points there. I mean, Paul, if perhaps I can come to you. If you had to pick a couple of taxes, you know, if what we are saying is that ultimately we're going to have to see tax rises, both in terms of, you know, the level of deficit and debt being unsustainable, at least in the long term, but also the fact that there is greater pressure for spending more and that the public want to see that, what are the least worst taxes?
Well, I mean, let me start by saying I actually probably agree with Nick more than he expected, in the sense that I think we are in a, you know, I think what Nick's saying essentially is we're in a pretty much a second best world where, you know, you probably politically just can't do the sorts of things that, you know, optimal tax theorists would say that you should do, like put VAT on everything and integrate income tax and national insurance and all those sorts of things. And we, you know, if we are in the world which Nick describes, which I think we are, which is that we're going to be spending more on health and social care going forward, we need to find the least worst way of doing that, and that may well be doing something which is, at least to a degree, a con, as Gordon Brown's 2002 national insurance rise was at least to a degree a con. Then that may just be the world we're in. And I also agree that increasing taxes on pensions in payment, for example, makes a national insurance surcharge, say, or a social insurance surcharge, or a social solidarity surcharge, or however you want to put it, on occupational pensions in payment would make sense from every point of view, both equity and efficiency, particularly because they've never had national insurance raised on them before. But if you're talking about serious amount, that will get you a bit, but a few billion, but it's not going to fill the sort of hole that we're talking about. And if you're going to do that, if we really are talking about a noticeable 2 or 3% of national income, which we probably are over the medium run. Now, put that in context, that's 50, 60, 70 billion quid. Well, in the end, you don't have a lot of choice there. I mean, you have to be thinking of putting pennies on income in receipt or spending. So that means, doing something which is, or at least looks like, increases in the main rates of income tax, national insurance, and VAT. Now, I don't think we've had an increase in the main rate of income tax since 1973, was it? Something like that. I mean, it's and we've had continual fall since then. Economically, I don't think having a basic rate of 25 rather than 20 would do any damage at all. Politically, it would mean you're in the wilderness for the next 50 years, probably. But it really is balancing those kinds of considerations. I do think this intergenerational thing is incredibly important. Pretty all of the tax rises that we've had and most of the spending cuts that we've had have fallen on the working age generation, and the pension taxation is a very good example of that. All of those who had accumulated enormous tax-free sums in the past have had those wholly protected. It's now very hard for anyone to accumulate much of a pension at all if they're of working age, both for sort of reasons of tax, destruction of occupational pensions, and lack of returns in the stock market. Getting around, what is again, there is the wonkish kind of argument, but equally people have a very deep set sense of fairness, which is, there was a contract. The contract was, this is how my occupational pension worked, and this was how the tax system was going to work. And, however much you might say that was the wrong thing to do, that's what you did, and it's my right. Actually having that's where getting some kind of consensus over how you, and that's why it's so hard to, one of the reasons why it's hard to tax wealth as well. And I think there are, I think this is an area where, as in many areas, there is quite a big gap between those of us who spend our lives thinking about the technicalities of this and where the British public is.
And can I just ask you one further question before I come to Polly? And I'd like to ask Polly about things like a one-off capital levy, which seems to be popping up its head, as well as this intergenerational question. But just on the pension point, so my understanding, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that doing something around the tax relief as well for pensions would be a way, in fact, of so, for example, if you lowered if you said, actually it's just going to be a blanket rate of 20% relief, rather than allowing the 40% for higher earners, which incidentally would be a way of hitting, obviously not actually just higher earners, because you don't have to be earning that much to be in the 40% bracket, but would hit better off people. Would that be something that government should look at in terms of being less distorting, perhaps, of behaviour than just increasing taxes on earnings?
Well, it would certainly, there's certainly a capacity to raise a significant amount of money by doing that. And it's worth saying that other than the VAT rise in 2011, cuts in pension tax relief have been by or distance the single biggest increase in tax we've seen over the last decade already. Of course, it wouldn't meet the intergenerational point at all. I mean, it will once again be hitting those of working age and leaving those who have already got their masses of tax relief unaffected. And I think there are technical economic reasons for wanting to keep the current system, but I accept that as a possibly relatively less painful way of raising, perhaps, I can't remember what the numbers are, maybe even north of 10 billion quid. Yeah. That's certainly one option. But again, we're very much in the world of the second and third best. I mean, one point I make on one-off capital levy is that, in a sense, we've already, had one, but with no one getting anything, because, wealth has already been hit by, 20-25% over the last 3 months.
Yeah. Okay. So staying on the point about capital levy, Polly. So one of the debates that has been perhaps raging is too much of an overstatement, but certainly has been, we've seen much more discussion about, is the need to rebalance taxation, which is predominantly on labour and earnings, and very little taxation in terms of proportionally of that we raise comes from capital, and perhaps there is a fairness argument, a social contract type argument, particularly when we know that at least some of the capital gains are in fact earnings that have just been taken in a different way. And there was an interesting piece in the Times a couple of weeks back by Ed Conway, I think it was, who was saying, maybe it's time to try a stupid idea, i.e. something like a one-off capital levy, and it would have to be one-off because you wouldn't want to give people the time to move all their wealth. Is that pie in the sky, or is that something, Polly, that you think maybe we should be thinking in terms of, more radically to get us through this period?
I think we definitely need to think more radically, and there is a clear fairness argument around this shift between income and capital taxation, especially where, as you say, you're talking about basically a different kind of income. Obviously, one of the challenges in taxing wealth is that it's static. It's not liquid, it's wealth, right? It's aggregated. Whereas when I'm getting paid, the money is being transferred from my employer to me, and there's very easy for the taxman to get in and take some of it on the way. Whereas I have to actively do something with my wealth to create some liquidity in order to pay a tax bill. It's one of the reasons why even our kind of quite small capital tax and council tax is so kind of widely loathed, and when it went up dramatically, in the kind of early part of this century, became a kind of enormous stick to beat the government with. So I think we have to just recognize there is just a genuine kind of practical challenge around wealth and capital taxation. It's much easier to tell the story about how it would be better than it is to make those taxes genuinely work. It's possible that a one-off tax has more value because it doesn't allow, as you say, a kind of a dramatic shift in behaviour. But it's still, we had this even with the mansion tax, which was really just a slightly higher council tax for high value properties. That in the end, it came down to David Cameron just knew too many little old ladies in big houses. He knew too many people who would be affected by it, and he just couldn't do it. And I guess, so what Nick and Paul have talked about really is a kind of around the storytelling of tax. It's very easy for people who are really super good with spreadsheets to forget that consent for taxation is really around storytelling. And Gordon Brown did pull that off in quite an impressive way around the income tax rise. He did it by asking somebody else to advise him on, how do I increase spending? And strangely enough, this expert report came back and said, well, if you want to increase spending, then you need to increase spending. He's like, oh, well, I'm going to have to put up some taxes to do it. But a complete artifice, right? A story. And that was at a time when deferral to an expert helped you to pull off that political trick. It seems to me that now, because of a whole range of reasons, some of that kind of valuing of expertise has been taken away. And in fact, where politicians get stuck in that way, they want to do something, they don't know how to navigate the politics of it, that the way is being led much more successfully by strategies that involve bringing the public in to help arbitrate around things like citizens' assemblies, that help you navigate the stories, the feelings, the trade-offs, by getting people to deliberate and discuss. we sort of half-heartedly attempted to do something around that with the spending review in 2010, but it just turned into kind of send us your ideas, oh public sector, and people sent in like, oh yeah, there's a lot, probably there's too much of a stockpile of gloves and gowns in this cupboard at our hospital, we could use that, turn that into a ward, and then everything would be fine, which turns out not to be in fact the best idea. So we need to focus on engaging the public, because that's how we're going to navigate political consent. It's very, I could tell you my favorite taxes. Yeah, like I mean, inheritance tax I think is a brilliant tax because you don't have to pay it till you're dead, which I'm massively in favour of paying.
Oh, pays it though.
But yet the story around inheritance tax is about punishing you for loving your kids, and we just have to find a way to navigate around that, or give up on it, and that has to be around deferring to the public. So we at Demos are doing a project that is, we're not doing a full citizens assembly, basically because we haven't got the budget for it, but we're doing a set of deliberative workshops with the public to try and evaluate lots of these choices that people make. And I think we do have to be more open to ideas that economists and tax specialists hate, like hypothecation, because if you can tell a different story, it changes the landscape. You know, we all know, can't believe I'm the one bringing this up, but tuition fees, right? Total bloody disaster politically, but they're not fees, right? Every other fee, you have to pay it. You don't have to pay this, you pay, it's a tax. Of course it's a tax. And in order for it to satisfy the ONS that it wasn't, it wasn't spending, we had to kind of create this thing calling it tuition fees and make it into a debt. And not only does that affect people's real life experience of it, because they feel that their choices are shaped by carrying this debt, which has a burden. However many times you tell people, oh, it's not a real debt, it feels like it, and feelings matter. But also, if we had constructed something that said, what we're asking you to do is, once you've been to university, which you can do for free, we'd like you to pay into a solidarity fund, an endowment fund for the next generation to be able to go to university. That storytelling, even if it looked exactly the same in payment terms, would have been infinitely more successful. I'm not saying it would have saved the Liberal Democrats, but you know, we have to think about stories in taxation much more. We spend too much time thinking about spreadsheets.
Yes, well, I think that is very true. Okay, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left until we draw it to a close. I mean, so many questions coming in. I'm going to do a very quick with the panellists. Yes or no answer, please. Scrapping, and I know, well, what would you replace it with? Blah, blah, blah. We're not going to do that. We're going to be, you know, simplistic about it. Scrapping the triple lock, yes or no? There we go. Thumbs up from Polly. Nick? Thumbs up. And Paul?
Yeah, probably, but it's one of these things which is much smaller than everyone makes it out to be. I mean, it's not the answer to anything very big.
Okay, well, I'm going to take it as a probably to say it's a unanimous across the board agreement from us. We think we should scrap the triple lock. Okay, I have one final question for Nick, please, just very briefly, that's been asked by one of our attendees, and then I'm going to finish with asking you each to give me your answer to. We've sort of, I mean, we've touched on it several times that in a crisis, there is a burning platform created that enables you to do things that you might not ordinarily be able to do had that crisis not happened. So thinking more on a positive note, if there was one thing that you think we might finally have an opportunity to do because, you know, either public perception or the economic situation allows us to, what would that be? It could be a tax, it could be an investment, it could be an approach to public services, anything. What would be a positive thing that you think, yes, let's seize the moment and let's do this thing? So I'm going to let you just think about that very briefly. And Nick, the last question from the audience I just wanted to put to you is, one person asked, if we're going to have to see rises in taxes, shouldn't there be more accountability then for how government spends it? And doesn't that mean that we should therefore be looking at efficiency and productivity at the same time?
Oh, totally. I completely agree. If ever there's a time we need to make the public sector more productive, more efficient, it's now. Bear in mind that in relation to the NHS, greater productivity for any given amount of resource means fewer nurses and fewer doctors. So you just need to manage that aspect of things. But look, this is utterly essential. And every government for the last 100 years has announced an efficiency programme, and I wish this government well.
Thank you. Beautifully put, and would very much be, I think, in line with the reform view of value for money. So by all means, raise more, but make sure you spend it properly. Okay, so I've posed the question that I want to come to. I did promise at the start that I would repost the poll just to see if we've shifted anyone's views. Live behavioural test here. So let me just pop up the same poll. If attendees could please vote, and then we'll see if we've changed it. And during the voting, if I can ask panellists to start answering that question. So what might be a positive thing, a positive change we could make? And Polly, I will start with you.
To finally fix social care, like, yeah, and I mean, exactly how you do. Honestly, I've stopped caring. I've had so many arguments about exactly which tax instrument you use and exactly who pays what when. Like, I just don't care. It requires a system level change, and I think it has become visible enough that there is now the potential, perhaps by calling a citizens' assembly on it, a proper one, not like the one that Sarah Wilson did, but make a choice, do it. We have to find a way to invest in this, and 30 years of trying has just led to failure.
Nick?
Totally agree, Polly. I'm going to try a different tack. How about finally revaluing the council tax and having a proper, sensible, self-assessed property tax like Ireland, and at the same time reduce the rate of stamp duty to enable people to move house.
Great. And Paul, please.
Oh, blimey, Polly and Nick have got the best ones. I agree with them completely. Well, I mean, this is maybe slightly tangential, but, you know, we've hopefully come to realise that it's not just, you know, university graduates who are valuable to the economy. So maybe it's time to sort out the further education, vocational education and apprenticeship systems, both as a priority for social justice and as a priority for economic productivity. So I would like to see a big push on that, partly as I think, you know, one could just about argue that, you know, it's become rather evident to us that it's, you know, it's not just, you know, civil servants and lawyers and so on who we rely on a lot of other people.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, I agree with all of those. And I guess I would add in, which is perhaps in ranking of fourth in terms of the ones that have already been said, I would also like to see the equalising of capital gains and income tax and national insurance as a way of us creating a fairer tax system as well. Okay, so we have the polling done. I will share the results. Not a huge amount of change, a little bit of a shift, but probably, to be honest, because there's an awful lot on a combination of the above. But luckily, we don't have anyone who doesn't know anymore. So I think we have in making sure that we have imparted enough wisdom that people feel at least clearer on what might need to happen. So let me just take that off. Okay, perfect. Well, we are at pretty much exactly time now. Can I say a huge thank you to Nick, Polly and Paul for giving up a chunk of your morning to talk about how we might put the public finances back on track. I think it has been a fascinating discussion, and I can tell that by the number of people who joined us, and we were at capacity, which is great, but also the fact that we have kept the majority of them with us, and we've only seen a bit of a tail off towards the very end, when I imagine people have had to go on to other calls. So thank you so much. Thank you all the attendees. I hope that you have enjoyed it. If you have any feedback for us, mostly if it's nice and positive, but you know, if there are any other tips that you want to give reform in terms of the future webinars, then please do let us know. Again, we're very grateful that you've decided to give up part of your Friday morning to listen to our discussion. We do, just very finally, we do have a webinar next week as well, which is about what next for the NHS. How do we make it more resilient? So do keep an eye out for that. We have been recording this. We will be posting it on the Reform website. I think it will be the Reform website. I'm sure one of my team will correct me if it's actually going to be YouTube or something. But anyway, it will be available. So because it's been so fascinating, I'm sure you will all want to watch it again several times just to make sure that you did pick up all of the ideas and the wisdom. So a final thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see everyone again soon for a future webinar. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.